I read a story the last couple of days about a man, and this man was married. He had a wife, and he had two small children. And this man had a dream to climb and summit the tallest mountain in the world, Mount Everest, over 29,000 feet, like twice as tall as the tallest mountain in Colorado. And he sat down with his wife and he talked to her about this dream of his, and she wasn't, really on board that much. Since they began keeping records of the people that have climbed Mount Everest, over 300 people have died. That mountaintop is actually still littered with bodies, people that have passed trying to summit. And it's so dangerous there that they leave them there. They can't even bring them back. They use some of those bodies as guides, which way to go and which way not to go, believe it or not. And this husband convinced his wife. He said, I'm not going alone. I'm going with somebody. I'm going to go with a friend, and we're going to hire a Sherpa, one of those famous guides that have been born in the mountains, and they have a larger lung capacity than a normal person does, is what they say. They could get more oxygen from the thin air up there, and we'll have a guide, and we'll go, and it'll be fine. And finally, he convinced his wife. And she said to him, "Go, but I want you to know that I'm going to be praying constantly for you." So after months and months of planning, he went. And he began to climb. He was with his friend and he was with the Sherpa. He made it to base camp, and then he made it to camp 2, which was about 1,000 feet left of climbing, about 1,000 feet. He made it to about 28,000 feet. And they had set up camp, and they had a final push to get to the top of the mountain. Well, his friend fell ill. His friend got very sick, and he could not continue anymore. Shortly after his friend got sick, the Sherpa also got sick. And the Sherpa was so sick that the Sherpa could not continue. So he was alone, just him. And he sat down and he thought about it long and hard, recognizing the danger of climbing and summiting this mountain on your own without help. He checked his gear and his oxygen tank, and he finally made the decision to go it alone and to climb. True story. And the weather looked good for the next 8 hours. They say that on Mount Everest, you could only really know what's going to be regarding the weather for about 8 hours. It's so unpredictable, just like it is here in Colorado. You never know what's going to happen, right? The weather changes so fast. Well, at 29,000 feet, the weather changes even faster. So he was confident that he had about an 8-hour period where the weather would be good. And he started his ascent, the last 1,000 feet, at 2:30 in the morning, the middle of the night, the safest time to climb. And he climbed, and he climbed. He got to what's called, I believe it's called the Hillary Ascent, or it's a cliff that's like 40 feet tall, vertical cliff, and he climbed with ropes all the way to the top. And about 6:30 in the morning, he made it to the top of the mountain. And he saw the sun come up over the horizon. And when the sun came up, he put on his goggles because the sun there is very powerful. But the day before, he had dropped his goggles. And the lens that would protect his eyes from the sun was damaged. And he didn't realize that at that point. And he stayed up at the top of that mountain, which is also referred to as the death zone, because at that altitude, there's not enough oxygen to keep you alive. And as soon as you get there, you begin to slowly die. And it's widely known that you can't spend a lot of time there. Humans aren't meant to be at that altitude. But he stayed almost an hour at the top. And when he finally decided that it was time to go down, all of a sudden he realized something. He realized that he couldn't see. There's something called snow blindness, where he basically, the sun is so bright and it shines so brightly off of the snow in the area that you sunburn the corneas in your eyes. And he could no longer see clearly. He saw shapes. If he squinted really hard, he could maybe make out like a little ledge or a hill. And he began to panic. He began to panic. I don't think that there is a scarier place to be in your life. But he calmed himself down, and he began to climb down the mountain, foot by foot, by foot, by foot. He arrived at that Hillary's cliff, that 40-foot cliff, and he somehow threw himself over the top of it, and he started to go down, but he slipped. One of his crampons, the snowshoes, fell off his foot, and he lost it, and he fell. And because of the movement that was happening then, it caused an avalanche when he was still attached to the rope. And snow barreled down over the top of him, and he held on for dear life. And at that moment, he realized that, you know what, this is not something that I can do. And he did what every person in the world does, believer or not believer. He began to pray. Because when it gets serious, people pray. Even if they don't believe, people pray. And he prayed. And he prayed. And he confessed later on that at that moment when he prayed, an unbelievable sense of calm came over him. The pastor reminded us of that image when the disciples were on the sea and the waves were tumultuous and large and high, and it was windy, and all of a sudden there was calm. The snow had passed over him, and he was still hanging onto the rope, and all of a sudden he felt that calm. And he can't explain it. He doesn't know how he continued to get to the bottom of the mountain, but he made it back to camp too. And his friend was there, and the Sherpa was there, and they took him into the tent, and he confessed that he fell asleep in the tent, and he slept for 15 hours straight. He did not wake up. Later, when he finally made it home safely, his wife had confessed to him that at that exact moment when he prayed, she felt like a stirring of the Spirit where God told her to pray. And she prayed. And she got on her knees, and she was praying at the same moment that he was praying. And God answered his prayers just like that. Sometimes that's how it works. Sometimes prayers are answered immediately. Sometimes you come before God with a problem, a big problem, and God somehow in a miraculous way resolves your issue immediately. We have a couple examples in Scripture where a prayer was answered immediately. Remember in 1 Kings chapter 18, Elijah's prayer for fire, right? The prophet of God, he challenged the prophets of Baal to essentially a showdown on Mount Carmel. And he prays, and the sacrifice is there, and he prays, and God sends fire from heaven immediately. Immediately. I want you to think about in Daniel 6, when Daniel, steadfast in prayer, even though there was a law given, a decree that nobody should pray, he continues to pray. And because of it, he's thrown into a den, into a big pit full of lions. I want to assure you that he prayed. He prayed. And in a miraculous way, God closed the mouth of the lions. Think about Acts chapter 12, when Peter was in prison and the believers were praying for him in that other room. And God answered the prayer just like that. An angel appears and guides him out of the prison. And he goes to where they're praying, and they can't believe that God answered the prayer immediately. Sometimes that's how it works. But God doesn't always answer prayers immediately, does he? I want you to think about how many times you've come before God with something. And maybe you've been praying for this something for a long time. And you don't understand why you've had to pray for this thing for such a long time. You don't understand why you've been asking. You've been faithful. You've been persistent. But God still hasn't answered the prayer in the way that you would appreciate, in the way that you would think would be the best way in your specific situation. And God doesn't answer the prayer right away. Sometimes there's a process that has to take place, a process that we can never understand because we don't see as far as God sees. However, in this parable, Jesus calls us to a life of persistent prayer. And just as the widow continued to seek justice, even though she was rejected initially, we're called to persist in prayer regardless of any obstacles that we face. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 17 reminds us we are to pray without ceasing, or to maintain a posture of persistent prayer before the Lord. I was talking to a brother, Dan, the other night about this way of this lifestyle of praying. It doesn't mean that you're on your knees from morning into night and you're praying nonstop, because that wouldn't be logical. You wouldn't be able to live the life that God gave you. But having an attitude of constant prayer, of constant communication with God, it's what God asks of us. The widow in the parable exemplifies an unwavering persistence in prayer. And even though the judge initially denied her, she refuses to give up. Even though he said no, she keeps on asking, and her determination teaches us the importance of persevering in prayer, even when it seems futile, even when you don't see anything happening, even when you continue to pray. Let's say you're praying for a brother or for a sister that doesn't know God, and you've been praying for them for years and you don't see any difference. If anything, they're getting worse. Even then, God calls you to persist in prayer. Hebrews chapter 4, verse 16 encourages us to let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. And that's what this widow did. She went before the judge with boldness and with persistence. Regardless of the denial that she received at first, it didn't matter. She knew she had to be persistent. Sometimes it takes time for our prayers to be answered. I want you to think of Abraham and Sarah's prayer for a child in Genesis 15 and 18. God promises Abraham and Sarah descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, as the sand on the beach. But she's getting old, he's getting old. But they pray and they continue to believe in their own way. It took time. I want you to think about in Exodus from chapter 2 to chapter 14, the Israelites' prayer for deliverance from Egypt. The Israelites endured centuries of slavery. Years and years and years of hardship, of prayer, of asking God for deliverance. And despite the suffering, despite the hardships, they continued to pray and ask for deliverance. But it was a process that took a long time. It took a long time. In Luke chapter 1, we read about Zechariah and Elizabeth's prayer also for a child. Just like Abraham and Sarah. They too were older. And at a point you say, well, biology's a thing. But God is greater and more miraculous than biology, than the laws of nature that he created, that he designed. He's outside and above of those laws. And even though something takes longer than you might expect, it's not in your timing, the reality is that you ought to persist in prayer, because God will answer in his timing.